Welcome, Kate Cornick of LaunchVic, and congratulations on the recent $186 million in government funding to support Victoria's startup ecosystem. We're eager to learn about it with you today. Thanks for joining.
Fantastic, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's always a pleasure.
We've been working with you for 4 years, and now we have Adam Brigu from Melbourne as part of our team to make sure we support and pay close attention to Melbourne. And we've seen quite an evolution. Getting such a large budget increase is a big success. Can you tell us a bit of a background? How did you get here? Maybe start with the growth of the startup ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. So LaunchVic was established 4 years ago 5 years now, 2016, as the state government's independent agency to grow the startup ecosystem. So the minister at the time recognised that startups were critically important to economic development and wanted a startup agency and establish LaunchVic. And when we started, we'd had some success, and there had been some unicorns. Brands like Seek had come out of the late 90s, and Aconex and created billion-dollar valuations. And there was some recycling of capital and people where Seek executives were coming back and reinvesting in the ecosystem, whether they were founding new companies or setting up venture funds. But the ecosystem was quite disparate. There was no real central point of coordination. So that was LaunchVic's job 4 years ago, was really to start to piece things together. And, we really ultimately wanted to create more billion-dollar companies, reimagine what our economy is going to look like. But it was coming off a very low base, as you know, JF, and we had startups, but it was probably, in the order of hundreds of startups, by no means thousands. And although we had some success in demonstrating you could grow billion-dollar companies from Melbourne, it was really the general psychology of the ecosystem was moved to San Francisco. So the people who really desperately wanted to create a startup and had a big vision, right on their roadmap was moved to San Francisco and Silicon Valley and start operating from there. And we saw a lot of brain drain happening. So LaunchVic really started with a $60 million fund from the Victorian government, and we invested it in programs. We didn't invest directly in startups. Our job was to invest in programs that would put in place the right infrastructure of the ecosystem. So we had a real attention to accelerators and pre-accelerators, education programs, events, building connectivity. And through that period of time, we invested in over 110 programs now, and helped accelerate over 300 companies, helped over 5,000 entrepreneurs hone their skills and ideas. So it's been very practical on the ground. It's not place-based. We've really very much been focused on Melbourne because that's where the majority of entrepreneurs are. But we haven't tried to do a specific precinct. We've really just thought about where are the highest quality programs and how can we help those programs deliver. Alongside all of that, we also had a research agenda. When we came in, at JF, as you know, we had very little data on Victoria's ecosystem. So all the knowledge we had was very much around what we thought, not what we actually had hard data to show. So we partnered with Startup Genome and also ran our own local survey to get even deeper insights and qualitative research to help inform investments. And we've worked very closely with Startup Genome and also our local survey every year so that we can continually have this very fast feedback cycle between knowing what's happening on the ground and then implementing programs. And so that research has really been very important to us in driving the right programs to help the ecosystem grow.
Yeah, and then so I imagine your role has changed, but I wanted to maybe tell us, how much has the ecosystem grown over these 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, so we now have we have 2,000 startups in Victoria, so it's growing at a rapid rate, and we're very pleased to see our movement in the Startup Genome rankings improve year on year. I think we improved 6 places in the last ecosystem rankings. Between 2019 and 2020, I think we're around 36 in the world, and definitely a growing ecosystem. We've also had some success with unicorn creation as well. So we're seeing more companies come through. We've had a couple of really big fintech successes in Airwallex and Judo Capital, as well as Afterpay. We have some strong biotech companies that have all reached billion-dollar valuations in Clinuvel, Polynovo, and Mesoblast, and there's others coming through. So we're definitely seeing the number of exits increase. We're seeing the ecosystem size grow. We're generally improving on all the measures that Startup Genome ranks us on, some faster than others, and there's definitely a lot more work that we need to do. But it's a very exciting ecosystem to be part of.
Yeah, we've been part of the journey and seeing you go from the activation phase to the globalization phase. And you've been, one of the most dynamic member we've had of Startup Genome. And dynamic means you're changing as your ecosystem is changing, and now you're becoming more of a scale-up ecosystem. And how has your role changed in the last couple of years now that you're there, where the brain drain is reduced, some of the most ambitious and the best are starting to create large companies? What's your new role?
Well, I think part of our role is advocacy and awareness. And so when we started out, it was very much about programs, and we were talking to the ecosystem. We were talking to the people who identified as being part of the ecosystem. And now our role really is around how do we talk to everybody, whether that's someone who aspires to be a founder of a company, doesn't necessarily recognize that they're a startup founder because they're living in regional Victoria and don't understand necessarily what a startup is as opposed to a small business, or whether it's an expat living in California that for a variety of reasons is looking to move home. And so we've definitely got a much bigger communications program that we've had. And I think a big part of our role now is bringing in new people to the ecosystem and continually feeding that. Part of that is focusing on talent. So we really have moved from focusing on founders only to continuing to focus on founders, but focus on investors and talent as well, because it's not just about getting the entrepreneurs going, it's about making sure we've got a really viable investment ecosystem, and when those startups begin to scale, there's a supply of quality talent that is going to help those companies grow. So we've really broadened ourselves out in talent piece, and investment, as I said, is a big piece, and we're increasingly moving into the investment world. Having said at the beginning that LaunchVic hasn't invested directly into startups, it's definitely something, and we'll come on to that in a moment, I'm sure, through our new budget. We're not going to be investing directly into startups, but we will be investing alongside through fund-of-fund models into startups. So it's definitely, the role is changing and growing all the time.
Okay, and we're going to go to the funds next, but I wanted to ask you before going there, if you look back to the last 4 or 5 years, and you talked about building infrastructure, startup support, and the different steps that got you now. But is there 1 or 2 things that are not obvious that you look back and say this was very important? And sometimes it's indirect actions are indirectly affecting the ecosystem, but allow you later to actually accelerate. Right? And any 1 or 2 things like that?
There's a few. I'll give you a plug, JF. I think the report you did for us in 2018, that coming to Melbourne and doing a deep dive was a pivotal moment, because you really and Startup Genome and your team gave us the data that gave us very strong evidence for things that we already knew. But so an example was, we knew our investor landscape was poor. We didn't realize how poor it was. And you identified a Australian close to $100 million shortfall year on year in seed funding. And that's obviously a massive problem for the ecosystem. That report was seminal in then us having the evidence to say we need to move into the investor landscape. And that then led us into a variety of different things. First of all, you pointed us to Josh Lerner, and we worked closely with Josh on a fund of funds model. The second thing we did was work closely on in educating investors, and that is something that people often think, well, investors know they've got money, they don't need support. Well, the reality is investors don't necessarily pay for their education, and so we need to make sure we're doing everything we can to educate investors. So we've set up a fabulous program at the University of Melbourne to help educate investors, and that's been hugely successful. And then the third thing was we really focused on launching new angel networks and getting people that were investing competently to catalyze networks and formalize networks around them to help educate. So that is a sort of one thing led to another, and now here we are with a couple of investment vehicles, well, 3 in fact, and that all came out of that one report, which was not what we were intending that report to be, but it certainly changed our vision of what we were trying to achieve. So I think that was a really big one.
Yeah, that's true, because the report was about, activating the community, talking about ourselves locally and globally. And then it became a source of insights and action. So I'm glad that had this impact. And what we see the results today, the really positive results, is a $186 million in money. And so can you tell us, how will you use these funds? Please go a little bit more details. I want to see really how is it structured.
So absolutely. So we, LaunchVic is going to be responsible for managing 110 million directly, and there's another a few million on the side. So which I'll step through. So LaunchVic itself will be managing a $60 million fund of fund. Well, in actual fact, we'll be managing government contribution to a fund of funds, which will be matched with 60 million from the private sector. So we'll be establishing a $120 million fund of fund that will specifically invest into early stage venture capital companies. And that's really about lifting that seed Series A funding gap that you've identified, that we've done a little bit to help with our angel networks, but there's still a massive problem there, exacerbated by COVID, we believe. So that's 60 million. We then have a $10 million Women's Angel Sidecar Fund, and that's really focusing on the fact that we recognize that women founders only constitute 20% of our ecosystem, and we can't expect to have late stage female founders if we're not getting female founders funded at seed stage. So we will be co-investing alongside our angel groups into any female founded company. So we won't be making the investment decision. We'll just be making sure that they get enough seed capital so that their seed round is large enough. We know from your data that the larger the seed round, the more likely they are to reach Series A. So that will be that program. Then on top of that,
we've seen a lot of research showing that there's an investor bias, right, towards female funders. So thank you for doing that. This is great.
Yeah. And then we'll have 40 million for LaunchVic to continue to do what it does. So that will be continuing to run programs to support founders, investors and talent, and continue to do marketing and awareness raising activities around entrepreneurship and the startup ecosystem, as well as research and policy advocacy. Then there is a $25 million contribution from government into a venture growth fund, which is a venture debt fund for Series B companies. So that will help companies access capital at relatively low cost. And venture debt is an attractive model for later stage companies and not having to give up as much equity. And that's particularly important in an economic recovery sense. And then the final sum of money is actually a loan scheme related to the federal government's R&D loan initiative in Australia. So we've got a very attractive R&D scheme where companies can get rebates in their tax if they're undertaking research and development. So the state government is actually loaning companies in advance of them getting their R&D tax benefit. So that actually just is about getting cash into startups as quickly as possible, particularly through this economic recovery stage.
Wow, this is quite a good portfolio view of how the money will be used. And yeah, it's a real big step forward compared to the budget you had. I remember last year and the year before, when even last year was contracted, and we kept saying together, this is the way of the future, the new economy, the digital economy. And I think with COVID, the transition to that digital economy accelerated, and it's great to see that your team and your government really saw the light and said this is time to invest more aggressively, not to contract. So congratulations on that.
I have to commend the Victorian State Government for really recognising that innovation is the key to recovery and the startup sector is important. And one thing that I will also say is the government's investing $2 billion in innovation more broadly. And so there's a $2 billion breakthrough fund. Bearing in mind we're a state government of Australia, which is globally a relatively small country. This is an enormous contribution into innovation in our state. So that's also very exciting, and there's more work to be done on the Breakthrough Fund, but that will undoubtedly also relate directly to the startup sector in the context of commercialisation, technology transfer and innovation capability growth. So it's very, very exciting to be in Victoria right now.
This is so great. And it's great for us to hear, because our message is always add a zero to your budget. This is the most important investment you're making. And I can see that, in Victoria, you have got there, you added a zero. So thank you so much, Kate, from LaunchVic in Melbourne, Victoria. Thank you for your continued membership in Startup Genome. And thank you for working with us, and we're so glad to be able to have the chance to support you in your success and see your resounding success and growing success of the startups and the scale-ups in Melbourne. So congratulations.
Thank you. And we honestly wouldn't have got here without Startup Genome and all the advice and data and insights that you've given us along the way. So it goes both ways, and it's a huge win for startups here, and it's a win for LaunchVic, and it's a win for Startup Genome. It's proving your model. So congratulations to you and your team.